perhaps he worried about her. He also worried about how she would survive financially, because obviously she had a good job. She was an editor of a society magazine, newspaper, and she had a good future ahead of her, which, you know, what would happen to all of that if she started traveling? But anyway, he did. He thought that would be fine for her to start traveling. That they discussed it, and she did. So moving on, Martha's first journey. Her first journey. Now, what she really wanted to do, because after Abdul Baha had gone back to Haifa in the Holy Land, he went back in 1913, and Martha was very keen to get to the Holy Land and to go on pilgrimage, basically, to visit the holy places there, and of course to visit Abdul Baha. That was her main aim in traveling, but she'd also got, you know, another agenda. So off she goes, the 13th of March, 1915. She arrives in Egypt, and this is a picture of Martha with a group of young Egyptian student Baha'is. And you see many, many pictures like this of Martha, always dressed in white. She would deliver talks. This was just the beginning, really. She would deliver as many talks as she could, and she always dressed in white. This was her way. So these are the first Baha'is that she's met outside of America. But while she was in Egypt, she was terribly disappointed because she found that she was unable to go to the Holy Land. I did a talk before on wealthy Tudor Pole and Abdul Baha, and of course the First World War was waging at this time. It was terribly dangerous. There was no way that she could go. And Abdul Baha dissuaded her from trying to come. It would have been far too dangerous for her to do that. Actually, sadly, she was in Egypt for 6 weeks. I think there was a lull in the war or the activities in the Holy Land, and Abdul Baha did cable her to come, but sadly she missed getting that cable. So basically she then sailed on to Bombay as it was known at the time. She went down to India, having missed Abdul Baha's letters. She visited the friends there. I think this first trip was a little bit more of a fact-finding trip. She visited the Baha'i friends, she gave talks, she spoke intensely. There's quite a nice description, actually, if I can just find it in the book, from her interpreter, who was a young student, actually, in Bombay at the time. And he describes Miss Root as he didn't think she really required a translator. He said as soon as people saw her, they would concentrate respectfully on her. And if ever I spoke, I was ignored. Heart spoke to heart, and there was no need of translation. I had never before witnessed such spiritual communion. So that's quite interesting, that he felt that she was just able to commune with people on this deep spiritual level. After this, Martha then travels to Burma. Now, her trip to Burma was quite interesting. If I show you in the next slide. In these days, when you travelled, there were very few hotels. They were just starting. There were no Airbnb. There was, nowhere to stay, really. So when she gets to Burma and she approaches the friends there, they're not sure where she should stay. But the wealthiest individual in Mandalay had a harem, and he suggested that she would be most comfortable there. And Martha takes advantage, and you can't read the print of this, of course, but what she was doing while she was traveling, she was still writing articles for the newspaper back home. She was still kind of employed by them still. And she would send these kind of articles back home. New York girl spends 10 days in a harem. So that was where she stayed. And of course, they were very fun articles, and the newspapers in America just loved them. And I think it gives you a sense of her, you know, she was a deeply spiritual person, but she had a great sense of fun as well. One didn't preclude the other. Now, Martha found her way to the Baha'i Center in Burma. Here's a picture of her. There she is in the center. Now, Burma in 1915 had a thriving, very large Baha'i community. Martha loved it there. She absolutely loved it. Up until now, she'd just met individual Baha'is in America. She hadn't really seen what the Baha'i way of life is. But in Burma, she did. In the Baha'i Center, they took in orphans, they looked after the elderly, they would teach the Farsi language, the Arabic language, so that people could read Baha'i texts in their original format. She absolutely loved the people there. And sometimes they would take her out to do up to 40 speaking sessions a day. So very, very tiring, not unlike Abdul Baha's own schedule when he was traveling himself. So very, very interesting for her to go there. She was still anxious to get to the Holy Land. It was still not possible. She felt very responsible for her parents, who are back, elderly now, back in Ohio. But she cabled them, and they were still okay. So she decided to continue her journey. So she heads on to Japan. And this is a photograph of Martha in Japan. This is Agnes Alexander, another young American Baha'i who was actually living in Japan at the time. And this young man, I've forgotten his name, but he was the first Japanese Baha'i. So again, because Agnes Alexander was there, she was now able to organize places for Martha to go and talk and present her, her delivery of the Baha'i Faith, the work for peace, work for unity, and all of that. Oh, Mr. Fukuta, his name is. I've just seen it. Because Martha was a Baha'i, it just opened doors to her. And actually, I did have the slide in of the premier of Japan, Premier Okuma. He looked very scary in the picture, and look him up on YouTube. And she managed an interview with him. So this was very interesting. She was then able to send an article home back to America saying that she'd interviewed the Premier of Japan. She was also there for the coronation of the Emperor Yoshihito and the Empress Sadako. This was a complete fashion scoop for Martha. And again, that went down very well with the newspapers back home. So this was her first journey. She then heads from Japan to Hawaii, and by the 29th of August 1915, she's now back in America. Okay, so when she gets back to America, Martha she's had sort of a fact-finding tour and all the rest of it. She then does a lot of work with the Baha'is in America. I'm not even going to touch upon this at all. If I do that, we'll have to have about 10 sessions. So she was in America for 4 years. She worked, phenomenal work that she did there. But basically, she just couldn't wait to get on the road again. She had itchy feet, and Abdul Baha wanted her to go down to South America. So that's where she was heading for. Sorry, November 1919 it was, 4 years since her first trip. She felt she had to go to South America. Now, Martha, she traveled with 17 pieces of luggage. This was not about her, I have to say. Martha dressed completely simply. She was not bothered about her appearance, but she was very practical. She had her typewriter with her. Typewriters were enormous in those days. It was way before having a little MacBook Air or, whatever we have now. She carried that with her. And also the other skill that Martha had was working with the Baha'is back in America to get literature on the Baha'i Faith published, because there was nothing. Very little had been translated into other languages. And so she carried with her books. With Roy Wilhelm, who was the first Baha'i that she met, they had been working on booklets. They produced 2 little booklets called Big Ben and Little Ben. They were blue booklets, and they just were kind of a synopsis of the Baha'i Faith, of its teachings. And she carried literally thousands of those with her. She knew that she would be able to earn her living now, because wherever she went to, she would be able to do her Baha'i work, and equally she would be able to send articles back to the Pittsburgh Dispatch, or in fact she contacted a syndicate of newspapers from America who were all keen on getting her stories. So there was a month's delay when she arrived at the port because of the striking seamen. Now Martha, not to miss an opportunity, she actually went and gave a talk to the seamen on the spiritual solutions for the economic problems in the world, and they received her very favourably, apparently. And anyway, soon she was on the ship, setting sail for South America. The ship was called the Alba. Now, I guess it was a cruise ship, I'm imagining. And it was basically the people that were on board, they were pretty wealthy. Martha was just going on the journey. She needed to get to South America, and that was the only way to get there. The people there were there to have a really good time. They would be smoking, gambling, drinking, and all the rest of it. Now, Abdul Baha had advised Martha not to seem cold and unsympathetic when meeting strangers. Help to make them feel at home. Ask if you may render any service to make their lives a little happier. Let those who meet you know without your proclaiming the fact that you are a Baha'i. And in fact, Martha, again, had a great time on board. She was really popular. Let me just read a little bit from the book here, because it's quite interesting. Yeah, the drinking on the ship was great and constant. The bar, which was next to Martha's room, was open from 6 a.m. to 2 a.m. in order to be accommodating to as many drinkers as possible. Martha's roommate was a champion poker player and stayed up half the night proving it. She also owned 2 monkeys which shared the cabin. So basically, Martha was in a cabin, her roommate was up half the night playing poker, and she'd got 2 monkeys in the cabin. But so in the midst of, this sophisticated, high living crowd, Martha was the most popular and surely the most unique woman on board. She shared in the gala festivities. As a fancy dress, she went as a Persian woman, and she was chosen by the captain to present the prizes. So basically, she just joined in with everybody, and the captain suggested that she gave a talk on the Baha'i Faith to all the passengers, which she did. The chief steward also suggested that Martha spoke to the Chinese seamen on board and gave them the Baha'i message. So there was a lot of interest in those days. So as they stopped off on their way around, I don't know if I can just minimize that for a moment. The ship was stopping, if I can see it with my really bad eyesight, Belém and Fortaleza. It was stopping in both of these places. Now, most of the passengers on board, they'd get off and explore whatever they wanted to do. But Martha was just really keen to, wherever she landed, she wanted to know the population, and she wanted to know the number of newspapers in the area. And so when she landed, she would do everything that she could to contact the newspapers. Now, she didn't have the language. She didn't know Portuguese. And in Belém, she landed, she went into the newspaper offices officers, she tried to explain that she was a Baha'i, that she had articles that she could give to them, and they were having real difficulty translating. But in walks an attorney who speaks fluent English, and he tells Martha that if she produces an article of 1,000 words, he will translate it and get it published. So this is what Martha did. She would, wherever she landed, she would get articles published in the newspapers. She would put books into libraries, and if she was there for long enough, she would give talks to various groups. Goodness knows how she did it, because she didn't even know anybody whenever she landed. When they then go on to Recife, she also lands in Fortaleza. In Recife, they now find out that in Bahia, where she's heading for, yellow fever is raging, and they've also got a few cases in Recife. So most people on the boat do not land, and in fact they're told that if they do land, they will not be taken back on board because of yellow fever. So Martha takes a chance and she lands there, and she just thinks that she's going to have to try to get a boat down, down to Bahia and Rio de Janeiro later. So basically she lands in Fortaleza. She still hasn't got any Portuguese. She goes to a hotel and she finds an American woman staying there. It turns out that this lady is called Lillian Vega, and she knows Lua Getzinger, who we saw in the slides earlier on. She then takes Martha route around all the local newspapers, the dailies and everything, and Martha gets articles published in all the newspapers in that area. Basically, wherever Martha landed, people would be attracted to her. She didn't know the language, she was alone, but people somehow came up to her and she was undaunted. She didn't let the fact that she didn't know the language put her off from sharing this message that she had for people. And it's worth noting that Martha, like Abdul Baha, they were traveling with a message of universal peace and unity. They weren't necessarily going around the world trying to make Baha'i converts. Many people did become Baha'i, obviously, but that wasn't their aim. It was to share this new message and these new teachings. So she then travels on, she goes on a boat, the Itapui, for Bahia, and they arrive there in the midst of violent storms. By the way, Martha hated traveling on the seas. It was the only form of transport. And she, again, like Abdul Baha, she traveled very simply, always in third class. And these stormy seas, she was always seasick, and it was just ghastly most of the time. Now, when she gets down to Rio de Janeiro, she knows that she's going to be going down to Argentina later. So she organizes, she cables back to America that she needs 5,000 booklets produced in Spanish that she will need in Buenos Aires. So Martha was always ahead of the game. She was always writing. She was always preparing to get booklets or the literature that she needed for all the places that she was going to. And it was not easy, not in 1919. So by the 5th of September, she went on to Sao Paulo. She found this paradisical, really. Many of the places she went to, it was so cold and she didn't like the cold, but here it was lovely paradise, forests and trees. And she was, again, on board, she would give the Baha'i message. She then gets down to Montevideo. She travels down to there on yet another boat. Now, interestingly, do you remember the roommate that she had back on the first boat coming out from San Francisco, the poker playing lady who would play poker all night and who had 2 monkeys? Well, she lived in Montevideo. So Martha only had a 12-hour stop there. So she made contact with this lady And she ended up helping her to put books in the library and to contact the newspaper editors in Montevideo. So basically with Martha, anybody who she met would help her on this journey. So she gave many talks in all of these places. She now travels down to Buenos Aires and spends some time there. The booklets in Spanish will have arrived. She contacts the newspapers again and gives talks to. She would give talks to anybody and everybody. I'll go into that a little bit more next week. But she would. The Theosophists were one group who always welcomed a Baha'i talk. Any groups, anyone at all. The Esperantists, she would give talks to. The universities, schools, colleges, they all seem to welcome her with open arms. Okay, so now Martha's difficulty now is she's got to get from Buenos Aires over the Andes Mountains into Chile, because she has promised Abdul that she will go up the west coast of South America up to Panama. So this is her goal. Now, this was a complete adventure story. So I have to read this from the book because it's just an unbelievable story. She, in those days, it was the days before Cotswold shops or, Mountain Warehouse where we can get all our waterproofs and everything. There was simply, nothing like that. And Martha just describes having on 3 sweaters, 2 woolen coats, a hat, and she was still freezing. So the trip would begin by train and then shift to muleback. Martha was fortunate in having a young Italian woman as a roommate from Buenos Aires. They began the journey by train. Now, a landslide had washed out the route that Martha was to have driven, so other means of transport were found. So the same Martha Root, who was setting a speed record through the French villages in Mr. Berg's automobile 17 years earlier, she now climbed on a mule to cross the snow-capped Andes. She recorded the experience in her diary. The trip by mule back over the top of the world for the Andes are amongst the highest ranges. The ancient trail led 10,400 feet above sea level. The people on mule were like infinitesimal specks clinging to mighty terraces. As ants in an endless and boundless forest, so we huddled on the edge of jagged peaks, frozen chasms, and stiffened mountain torrents. Fortunately, the sun shone brightly. There was a wonderful feeling of camaraderie. Martha was part of a little tour of people who were doing the same thing, trying to get to Chile. A detour through one dark mountain took over an hour in stumbling, slipping blackness in which the frightened mules shied and fell. Martha, as her mule plunged downward into the mouth of the tunnel, gripped the pommel, terrified. Later, out from the tunnel, when the procession came to a precipitous downward slope towards Chile, Martha could not even see 1 inch in front of her. Such was the mist that had fallen. To her, this was by far the most dangerous part of the journey. Now, everyone got off their mules and began walking farther in on the mountainside. Sometimes the mules would slip a yard in this perpendicular path. They were frightened also. Taking the guide's hand, they made the descent together. The warm sun had melted the crisp snow just enough and they could get a foothold. They stopped every few minutes to breathe, as one's breath is very short in this altitude. Some fainted, some had puna, which is breathing of the nose and ears. The descent was finally complete. and the other side of the Andes was a victorious reality. So let's just look. Martha managed to make the journey up through the west of South America, and she got to Panama, to the Baha'i house of worship there. And in fact, this building wasn't there, but when Martha was there, she predicted that one day there would be a university, a place of learning for the Baha'is in the future. So that was that. And her last journey, which was to Central America, Mexico and Guatemala. So this is Martha's third journey. Basically, from South America, she went back to the United States after Panama. She also tried to land on a leper colony in Panama, but was unable to do so because of the sea conditions. She was soon back in Florida. And again, she did much on the home front, not least the first Race Amity Conference on the 19th of May, 1921. That's worth mentioning that. And that included Lewis Gregory, who Terence spoke about. Now, from this time onwards, Martha is 49 years old. The breast cancer, which we mentioned at the beginning, had somehow been in remission all this time. But for many years now, she was in great pain. She'd got pain in her chest and in her stomach. She was also worried about her father's health, which was deteriorating. But slowly his health improved, as did Martha's. So she was ready to go again, and she wanted to. So she headed down from America to Mexico. Her goal was Mexico and Guatemala. And this story won't take too long. What was funny about the story, though, was when she headed down to Texas in Austin, and basically never to miss an opportunity on her way down. Again, I'm going to read from the book because it's just much more fun. I should just mention on the way down, she visited Eugene Debs at the federal prison. He was an activist for the rights of labourers, and Martha supported him very much. And in fact, her letters helped to get him released from prison. And Mr. Debs remained a friend of the Baha'is right throughout his life. And I love the way that these early Baha'is in the 1900s, they just worked with anybody and everybody, as we try to now, who are working for peace and justice. We're all part of the same process, and that was interesting. The other funny thing was, in Texas, Martha decided there was a group of 25 miles from Austin in the Texas mountains, where her companion, Anna Reinke, was raised. There, at a Saturday night dance, the cowboys were told about the Baha'i Faith. So she just couldn't resist, a group of cowboys, they certainly needed to know about it. So she reports, at 10:30, after the Texas jigs, everybody sat down, and Miss Root, she always referred to herself in the third person, she never said I, gave the history of the Baha'i cause and all the vital principles. Miss Reinke passed around the blue booklets. The cowboys were interested and showed their appreciation. Martha felt that those cowboys would be fearless in proclaiming the message of world peace, since in that region they were undoubtedly courageous through their life on the rough Western trails. That was just an interesting aside. So just to finish off then, Martha makes her way down to Mexico. Now, as Bernie said, I spent a bit of time as a Baha'i in Mexico and Belize. But unlike Martha, like Martha, she arrived not knowing a soul. I was the same, but I met up with some Baha'is pretty quickly. There were no Baha'is in Mexico when Martha was there. So she didn't know a soul. And she just decided, again, she was a journalist, her first call was made to President Alvaro Obregón. She just walked straight in. More than 100 soldiers stood around the palace office building, which extended the entire length of the cathedral plaza. She explained that she was bringing the President of the Republic of Mexico Baha'u'llah's solution of the economic problem. She showed several introductory letters of recommendation. Now, she never gets turned away. This is the funny thing about Martha. The soldiers ushered her from one official to another until she reached the private secretary of the president. He spoke English perfectly. She explained and gave through him to the president Baha'u'llah's economic solution. So that was quite interesting. So she didn't actually get to see the president, but it would all have been passed on to him. So during the 3 weeks in Mexico, Martha contacted editors of magazines, newspapers, spoke in churches, both Catholic and Protestant. She was the house guest at a congressman's wife in Puebla. So all of this from knowing nobody, from knowing not a soul, all of these things happened. And then the final thing that happened was she went down to Guatemala. Now, I've been to Guatemala. When I was there in the 70s, there was a lot of political unrest right through Central America. And it was no different when Martha was there. In fact, everybody, her friends back in America, begged her not to go. It was just far too dangerous. But she boarded a train. She was told that nobody would be on this train, but there were. She made friends with a German woman whose son met them at the border. And because of the son's friendship with the Central American consul, he managed to validate Martha's passport, which saved her from staying for 4 days to get her passport validated. So basically then, she got into Guatemala. Her first sortie was to arrange an interview with the President of the Republic, Carlos Herrera. She spoke with the secretary of the minister, explained the Baha'i teachings, and left several Baha'i booklets. Now this time she secured an interview with the president. So that was quite a coup. An interview with the president was arranged for Monday or Tuesday at 2:30 p.m. Always mañana, but nonetheless, she'd got an interview. So she appeared on the Monday, but Martha was asked to come back on the Tuesday. Now, such was the political situation. By Tuesday, President Herrera was ex-President Herrera. He'd been deposed overnight. And this was the revolution. Machine guns were in action all over the city all night. The place was surrounded by 500 soldiers. President Herrera was kept a prisoner there, and his cabinet were imprisoned in the fortress. But the Baha'i message had been given to the liberals, some of the very men who the next day went into the office under the new government. So that was Martha's time there. When she looked back, this was actually in November 1921, and she was very scared, you have to say. You know, she was only human. She was scared. But she prayed to Abdul Baha, and significantly, the very night when all of this happened was the night when Abdul Baha passed away in Haifa. Martha didn't know that at the time, of course. But she, she felt this was very significant, that happened on that night. I'm going to stop there. I'm so sorry. I've gone way over. And, you can see next week when we start the rest of her journey, Martha is approaching 50 years old. So any of you out there who think your life is over at 50, think again. So next week, we'll be looking at her several visits to Queen Marie of Romania, King Zog of Albania, presidents, so much, more than this week. So I'm going to have a job to get it in one session again. But thank you very much for listening.